This is the first of the genealogical documents that our founding fathers studied and plagiarized from. And we have to understand the history of England at the time. The King of England, King Edward, was King Edward the Confessor. He was very pious. He didn't have any children. But he had a brother-in-law. And he had planned on leaving the kingdom to his brother-in-law. That was his, kind of his right-hand man, his liege. And, but there was William the Conqueror, that was the Duke of Normandy, that wasn't going to have any of it. And when he found out, when he heard that Edward had died, he had amassed he got ships and he came across and headed towards England. But there was also somebody else, as Harold Hardrada from the north. It was the Viking king. And he was also very interested in when Edward died. And he knew that Harold was, Edward's brother-in-law was weak. And so Harold Hardrada from the north attacked England. And Harold took his forces and went to the north. Now back then it's not like they got on a train or a plane or an automobile. The officers rode, who were usually noblemen, and everyone else marched by foot. And it was quite an arduous march to the north. And they fought Harold Hardrada. Now Harold came across the straits with 300 ships, left going home with only 32. So it was quite a substantial battle. But while they were in the north fighting the Vikings, William had landed, was coming into the southern shores. And so they marched from that battle, already battle weary, that long distance down to Hastings, where they met William. Subsequently, Harold was shot through the eye and killed, and William became the King of England. This is the last, Harold was the last Anglo-Saxon king that sat on the throne of England, and he was only there 3 months. From then, it's been a foreign king or queen on the throne of England ever since. It's not been an Anglo-Saxon. And so William, coming from France, spoke French. He came into England, and their culture and their language was completely different. The people of England had probably the most complex governmental system of that day. And William, coming from France, didn't quite understand the culture, and he had a completely different language. And so what he did when he came in on Christmas Day, when they were going to crown William the king, the people of England showed up at the Abbey in a big crowd to cheer their new king, and the king thought it was an insurrection, and he slaughtered them all. So the culture was just that different. He brought in foreign judges. That in fact, the people that were charged with crimes couldn't even speak English in the court. If they didn't speak French, they didn't even know or have a clue what was going on in court. And so they could be convicted with a foreign language that they didn't even understand, with foreign laws. And they were used to the common law under King Edward. So the culture was completely different. William also came in and he moved barons out and threw them off their land and brought friends in from France and gave them those properties so that he could maintain his power on the throne. William had 3 sons. The oldest was Robert, the middle one was William Rufus, and the youngest one was Harold. Because William was the Duke of Normandy, he controlled both England and Normandy. So he was sort of the sovereign in both places. When he was ready to die, he gave Robert the kingdom of England, and he gave William Rufus Normandy, but he didn't have another kingdom or another realm to give Harold. So he gave Harold 50,000 pounds, and he was supposed to be happy with that. Well, Harold was the quintessential politician. They said if Harold was praising you, you had to look around because there was an assassin somewhere. He would stroke your ego and raise you up so that he could get you in his sights, and then he would demolish you. And he did this with his brothers. When he was with Robert, he would praise Robert and stroke his ego and pit Robert against William. And then when he was with William, he would praise William, stroke his ego, and pit him against Robert. Well, Robert was so done. He was still over it with fighting with his brothers. He said, I would rather fight in the Crusades than fight here at home with my brothers. And so he left for the Crusades. Well, Harold was pretty happy about that because Harold figured if he left for the Crusades, then that left a realm for him. Well, William Rufus wasn't giving up anything that he had. He took what William left, and he kept what he had. And so William Rufus was then the ruler of both England and Normandy. That wasn't quite Harold's plan. So one day William Rufus went out on a hunting expedition, and Harold went out on another one, on a different one, and oddly enough, William Rufus was shot through the eye and killed in a hunting accident. And Harold beat feet back to the abbey as fast as he could, and he went to the guards and he demanded his father's scepter and demanded the access to the treasury. Well, the guards weren't going to do it at first, and he drew his sword, and they finally acquiesced to it. Now, Harold said to the barons at that time, see, at that time it wasn't, you just didn't become king. You had to have, there's never been a true monarchy. Everybody understand that? There's never ever been a monarchy where the king controls everything by himself and everybody's just under the king. He's always got his dukes and his earls and his parliament of some sort to get things done. So there's never a king, one person that's in control of the entire government. And so at that time he had to have the blessing of the dukes and the earls. Well, the dukes and the earls knew how ruthless his father and his brother was. And they were having a little problem with Harold. Also, they knew that Harold was a murderer. Everybody knew it. It's kind of like everybody knows that Hillary Clinton's guilty of treason, but she's still not in prison, right? So it was a lot the same then. It was the same thing. They knew it, but they were just kind of conflicted about it. So Harold said, look, if you guys agree to let me be king, I will write a charter, a coronation charter, in which the kings of England will no longer be evil and oppressive. Think about that. That all the kings of England would no longer be evil and oppressive. Well, to call something evil and oppressive, you have to know the difference between good and evil, right? You have to know that something is right and something is wrong. So obviously, Harold knew what oppression was and what was wrong. And so that's what brings us to the 1100s Charter of Liberty. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberty or the Coronation Charter. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. This is the promise that Harold made to the people of England when he took the throne. Charter of Liberties of King Henry I, the Coronation Charter, AD 1100. With this charter granted by Henry when he ascended the throne, the king formally bound himself to the laws, setting the stage for the rule of law and constitutionalism. The Charter of Liberties inspired those who compelled King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 and served as the model for that great document. That's why in school, when they start you out at the Magna Carta of 1215, they're doing you a great disservice, because that's not where this idea of liberty started. The idea of liberty started with the 1100 Coronation Charter. And that is, they understood that the king had a divine right to rule, but the Anglo-Saxons are the first ones that came out with this idea that they have a divine right to liberty. So even though the king has a divine right to rule, the people by virtue of being in God's own image, have a divine right to liberty. So this is where they start rectifying this conflict between the king's divine right to rule and the people's divine right to liberty. This is where it started. Henry, King of the English, to Bishop Sampson and Urso de Abitat and his barons and faithful, both French and English of Worcestershire, greetings. Number 1, know that by the mercy of God and the common council of the barons of the whole kingdom of England, I have been crowned king of said kingdom. And because the kingdom had been oppressed by unjust exactions, I, through fear of God and the love which I have toward you all, in the first place, make the holy church of God free. What is in the very first chapter? The church of God free. So you'll see in all of these first 5 documents, one of the first things in each and every one of them is the king should not be in the church. And then you'll notice in our Article 1 of the Bill of Rights, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Where do you think our founders got that from? They got it from these 5 genealogical documents, from 700 years of history that they understood. What happened in 1913 with the 16th Amendment? We turned our churches into 501c3s, didn't we? And we couldn't wait to ask the king into the church. And the churches have been bad ever since. Does everybody remember 2020 when churches were shutting down because the king said so? Shouldn't they be operating under the pleasure of God, not under the pleasure of the king? I mean, we had 1,000 years of history to understand it. Why have we invited the king into the church? That's a big question. So, in the first place, make the holy church of God free, so that I will neither sell nor put to farm, nor on the death of archbishop or bishop or abbot will I take anything from the church's demesnes or from its men until the successor shall enter it. And I take away all the bad customs by which the kingdom of England was unjustly oppressed by his father and his brother, which bad customs I here set down in part. So remember, Edward was the common law. Edward, the confessor, was a very pious ruler, and he believed in justice, and that's where the common law comes from. Sid does it to me every time. Halfway through it stops. If any of my barons, earls, or others who hold of me shall have died, his heirs shall not buy back his land as he used to do in the time of my brother, but he shall relieve it by a just and lawful relief. Likewise, also the men of my barons shall relieve their lands from their lords by a just and lawful relief. So if we understand how England was set up, you had a king, and then the barons and earls had what was called real estate, and then the serfs and the peasants lived on that real estate as sharecroppers for the baron or the earl. So what the king is saying is any of the barons and earls, their real estate, there's not going to be inheritance tax on it anymore, because that's evil and oppressive in 1100 England. Isn't that odd? And we have an inheritance tax here. But I guess it's not evil and oppressive because we're America, right? Yeah, okay. The principles are the same. But what he's saying is, because I do this to my barons and earls, I expect my barons and earls to treat the people with the same law. Three, and if any of my barons or other men should wish to give his daughter, sister, niece, or kinswoman in marriage, let him speak with me about it. But I will neither take anything from him for this permission, nor prevent his giving her, unless he should be minded to join her to my enemy. And if upon the death of my baron or other of my men, a daughter is left as heir, I will give her with her land by the advice of my barons. And if, on the death of her husband, the wife is left, and without children, she shall have her dowry and right of marriage, and I will not give her to a husband unless according to her will. 4, but if a wife be left with children, she shall indeed have her dowry and right of marriage so long as she shall keep her body lawfully, and I will not give her unless according to her will, and the guardian of the land and children shall be either the wife or another of the relatives who more justly ought to be, and I command that my barons restrain themselves similarly in dealing with the sons and daughters or wives of their men. So, we had women's rights. See, we used to have arranged marriages under William and William Rufus. There weren't arranged marriages anymore because the king used to do that to keep power. The king used to do that to keep his people in place. He didn't want somebody marrying that land off to somebody that was contrary to him. He wanted that land to stay in the hands of the people that were loyal to him, correct? 5, the common seigniorage which has been taken through the cities and counties, but which was not taken in the time of King Edward, I absolutely forbid henceforth. If anyone, whether a moneyer or other, be taken with false money, let due justice be done for it. Now, do you think Henry, being the scourge that he was in his own family and killed his own brother, he sounds like such a great guy in this 1100s charter, doesn't he? See, I don't think that Henry really agreed with it either, but he knew to keep his head and be king, he had to agree to certain things. So there was the go along to get along politics even then. 6, I remit all pleas and all debts which were owing to my brother, except my lawful fixed revenues, and except those amounts which had been agreed upon for the inheritances of others, or for things which more justly concerned others. And if any one had pledged anything for his own inheritance, I remit it. Also, all reliefs which had been agreed upon for just inheritances. So this had a lot to do with property rights, didn't it? So we understood that the ownership of property is liberty. What do we hear a lot of talk of now? Well, property rights are contrary to the social rights, to the social compact, right? We hear that a lot from one side. 7, and if any of my barons or men shall grow feeble, as he shall give or arrange to give his money, I grant that it be so given. But if, prevented by arms or sickness, he shall not have given or arranged to give his money, his wife, children, relatives, or lawful men shall distribute it from the good of his, for the good of his soul, and as shall seem best to them. So again, here we have survivors' rights in property. There's anybody here have a will or a trust? Okay, so you can set a will and a trust up so that your heirs get what you want, less what the government steals from them. But if you don't have one, there's called rights of survivorship. If you're married, your wife instantly becomes the beneficiary of your property. If your wife dies with you, your children become the automatic beneficiaries of that property if you don't have a will, up to a certain amount, right? Because it's all about money. After a certain amount, it goes to probate, and then the state gets to keep what they want, and they'll give a pittance to your survivors. If only our government knew what the 1100s Charter of Liberties said. 8, if any of my barons or men commit a crime, he shall not bind himself to a payment at the king's mercy, as he has been doing in the time of my father and my brother. So, these are called bills of attainder, where I can commit a crime if I know what the monetary cost of it is. And so I can decide, if I want to kill my neighbor's horse, it's only going to cost me $200, so I'll go ahead and kill his horse because I can afford the $200 and that horse really ticks me off, right? As long as I'm a nobleman, can afford it, the law doesn't mean anything. I've got a bill of attainder. I know what it's going to cost me to do it. There is no threat to my liberty. There's just a threat to my financial situation, right? That's a bill of attainder. You think we have that today? You ever get a traffic ticket where they say, well, you can either go down and pay the $120, or you can go to court on this date, and, well, if you've already got a cost of it, how's that not a bill of attainder?
I can get my laptop of the right person.
But know that we're talking regulatory law, and that's an invention in the 20th century. So, but what was happening then is if the barons committed a crime, if they took liberties with one of the young ladies of their men, all they had to do was pay a fine to the king and everything was good. Or if they killed someone, or if they committed some crime, because they were noble, they just got to pay a price. They weren't under the same law as the commoners. And this is what Henry's talking about here, is no longer are those of royal blood above the law, that all are under the law. And this is a key concept that comes all the way through to our founding documents in America. So if any of my barons or men commit a crime, he shall not bind himself to a payment at the king's mercy, as he has been doing in the time of my father or my brother, but he shall make amends according to the extent of the crime, as he would have done before the time of my father in the time of my other predecessors, where he's talking about the common law, right, justice. But if he be convicted of treachery or heinous crime, he shall make amends as is just, which means that if the crime, if a commoner, if the sentence was death, what the commoner did, the sentence would be death for the baron as well. So if a commoner hung from the neck until dead, then the baron or the earl could as well. So it was almost our 14th Amendment, such as equal protection of the law. All were equal under the law. It didn't matter about your noble birth. You were supposed to be equal under the law with all men. 9. Now, this is an interesting one. This almost sounds like Bill Clinton wrote it, but I'm just saying. I forgive all murders committed before the day I was crowned king, but I didn't kill my brother. And those which shall be committed in the future shall be justly compensated according to the law of King Edward, the common law. Isn't that odd how he forgave all murders prior to him being crowned king? But his brother died in a hunting accident. For sure, it was a squirrel that shot the arrow. 10. By the common consent of my barons, I have kept in my hands forests as my father had them. That becomes important when we get into King John and the Magna Carta 1215. That the taxes were so high that the people couldn't feed themselves, so they would go to the king's forest and they would shoot the king's deer without the king's permission. And so they would be drawn and quartered for it, or they would have their hands cut off for it. And all they were trying to do is feed their families because they were taxed beyond belief. So that part becomes important when we get to there. 11, to those knights who render military service for their lands, I grant of my own gift that the lands of their demesnes plows be free from all payments and all labor, so that having been released from so great a burden, they may equip themselves well with horses and arms and be fully prepared for my service and the defense of my kingdom. So there was tax breaks then for service to the nation. 12, I impose a strict peace upon my whole kingdom and command that it be maintained henceforth. This is why I do not like the term law enforcement. I love the term peace officer, because that's what the officers of the government were supposed to do, is keep the peace. And we'll find out about that in the Federalist Paper 51. Madison talks about it there. 13, I restore to you the law of King Edward, which was the common law, with those amendments introduced into it by my father with the advice of his barons. By advice and consent, does that sound familiar? What does our Senate do with our executive branch? Through advice and consent? Okay, so you can start seeing the seeds that are planted in our very documents. 14, if anyone, since the death of King William, my brother, has taken anything belonging to me or to anyone else, the whole is to be quickly restored without fine. But if anyone keep anything of it, he upon whom it shall be found shall pay me a heavy fine. So there was some amnesty granted. Witness Maurice Bishop of London and William Bishop elect of Winchester and Gerard Bishop of Hereford and Earl Henry and Earl Simon and Walter Gifford and Robert de Montfort and Robert Bigot and Edu the Steward and Robert son of Hamo and Robert Mallet at London when I was crowned, farewell. So you're going to see a lot of these old English documents read pretty close to the same, and the kings all started them out the same, and they ended them pretty much the same. There was always this hoopla of I being granted this authority by God to rule, and praising all the noblemen, and then they go through their list of what they're going to talk about, and then at the end they do some more pleasantries and then end with a farewell. Now that's important, because in one of the documents you were going to find that when the king accepts it, and all of these documents were not accepted freely by the kings of England. It was almost always forced upon them, except for Mary and William of Orange, which were the first and only king and queen of England, and we'll read about that and get into that history when we get into the British Bill of Rights of 1689. That's the first time that the kings and queens of England were forced to take an oath to the law, an oath to a principle written down on a piece of paper, and they were expected to be held to that oath. We get the same thing in our Constitution, in Article 6, Section 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution. That's where you're going to find the oath of office. And it's odd how the oath means nothing today. It meant something in 1689. The oath has gotten to a point where it means nothing today. But what do you expect when we have no-fault divorce, where I can take an oath to God to my wife, but I can break that 3 or 4 times if I want to, and nobody even bats an eye to it. It's all right. It's okay. We can do that. Well, if we can just violate an oath because we just don't feel like holding the oath anymore, what good is Article 6, Section 1, Clause 3? Well, there was things that were put in place in our Constitution to hold our elected officials to the oaths that they take. And there's checks and balances throughout the Constitution for that. But through the 20th century, through the progressive period, we've all been trained contrary to it through the John Dewey model of public school, which, does anybody know who John Dewey was?
Marxist.
Yeah, absolute Marxist. He was an ardent socialist. And our public school is set up on the Communist Manifesto. Anybody ever read the Communist Manifesto? Anybody ever read the Illuminati papers? Because they're almost identical. In fact, that's where the Communist Manifesto comes from, is the Illuminati papers that we discovered in 1776. So, a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be teaching, a lot of stuff you're going to hear, upon first hearing it, you're going to go, oh, that can't be true. But I'll back up everything I say, because everything I say is not my words. They happen to be our founders' words, and they have to be words from history and happen to be the lessons that our founders looked at through history. So when I tell you something and you go, oh, that can't be true, just know it. These aren't my words. These are our founders' words. And you may sound crazy and new to you, and that's because it has been kept away from us through the 20th century so that we could slip into this despotic state that we're in. See, when people know the truth and the real history, you can't enslave them. During the slave days, they never let the